All right, so this is going to be a quick little video on sculpting in Blender. And so this is geared for beginners, but however, if you haven't watched my Blender basics video, go watch that. I use a lot of add-ons and I do all kinds of nonsense, but I'll teach you how to move around and do all that fun stuff. So just keep that in mind. And I expect you to kind of know how to orbit and move and all that fun stuff. So like orbiting around, zooming in and out. But nonetheless, default settings here. I'm going to go back to default for this and just give you a quick little demonstration on how to set up the sculpting window. So, you know, layout works. You can sculpt in here. If you were to go to Sculpt Mode, it works just fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But Sculpting tab, already pre-configured and set up, and it has a lot of things turned on by default. So it's using a matte cap and whatever else might be going on here. Nonetheless, pull the side panel out. It's going to help you quite a bit. Personally, I still press in and just leave this panel out a lot of times. And then also, I like to turn on statistics. I like to see how many faces I actually have so I know what I'm doing here when it comes to polygon counts and whatnot. All right, edit preferences. We'll go to key map, pie menu, tab for pie menu. All right, and so I'll go in and out of object mode quite a bit. That's just what I do. That's kind of my basis starting point. If I don't use any other add-ons or anything, I have to have those settings configured like that. So when you go to Sculpt Mode, there's a couple different ways you can sculpt. You can use dynamic topology. You can sculpt right directly on your mesh, or you can sculpt using multi-resolution modifier. And there's also a kind of an automatic voxel retopo sculpting method. There's a lot of different things that go into this, but it's not that complicated, and you'll see why here in a second. So I'm not going to go over every tool, but I'll go over a lot of them. So draw, most probably everybody uses the draw tool to start with, but actually you'll find that you'll end up using some of the others more as you continue throughout this. Also, under, right here, wireframe. Assign this to quick favorites or shortcut or something so you can turn it on and off real quick. So I make it the back button on my mouse. The little button number 4 is what it is. All right. And so that's going to allow me to start sculpting. Basically, if you try to sculpt on this mesh right now, the default cube, there's not enough geometry here to make any difference. So you're not going to get any results out of it. I'm going to turn on X. This is your symmetry right here. And I'm just mirroring X. I'm not going to change anything else here right now. And I'm going to turn on dynamic topology, and you'll instantly see, well, first it complains there's no vertex color, or it will not preserve vertex color UVs or custom data. I want to explain this real quick, because if you turn this on, click OK, that's fine. When you start sculpting, you're going to start using the dynamic topology system. I'm going to explain this a little better here in a second, but basically, when you start sculpting, it subdivides your mesh, right? And so you can see that it's subdividing wherever you're sculpting. And that's what dynamic topology does. It turns it into a bunch of little triangles. It's really cool, and it works well. But what I want to show you here real quick is that when you go back to object mode, and you go back into Sculpt Mode, dynamic topology is turned off again. The reason it does this is because you go to Object Data Properties, under UV Maps here, you'll see that this cube has a UV map, and just get rid of it. So next time you turn on dynamic topology, it doesn't give you that warning. You don't have to click OK every time, and you can sculpt on it, go into Object Mode. If you go back to Sculpt Mode, it still stays on. So you don't have to keep resetting it every time, which is real nice. All right, so wanted to get that kind of knocked out of the way there and just let you know that's how that's working. All right, so what it's doing right now is it's using a method called subdivide collapse. So basically, the more you zoom in, it'll subdivide more, give you more detail. If you zoom out, it'll collapse it down. So subdivides and collapses. There's a couple different methods you can use. Subdivide collapse is one. There's also subdivide edges and collapse edges. So usually you probably end up using subdivide edges. And basically, so when you zoom in now, it adds more detail. If you were to zoom back out, it doesn't take detail away. So it doesn't collapse it again. Instead, you can use a tool for that, the Simplify brush. And you can see that it still does, in fact, do the collapse. Okay. And it's based on the view, how close you are, how far away you are. So you can certainly use that method if you need to. I'm going to leave it on subdivide collapse for now. And so you can see we can come in here and paint. Detail size, if you turn this down, it will actually give you more detail as you make strokes. So now let's talk about the brushes a little bit. So if you left click, you can sculpt, control, and left click, you can do the opposite. So there's a plus and a minus here. That's what you're toggling between. So every time you hit control, it's going to do the inverse operation for the brush. Pretty simple, right? Nothing too crazy about all that. So you just get in there and start having some fun. Now, let's go to, there's a lot of different brush settings. I might talk a little bit about it, but we're not going to get too into it. Keep the wireframe on for a second. And so this regular sculpt tool will allow you to subdivide and collapse. Some of these tools will not. So if I use Sculpt Draw Sharp here, right, you'll see that it doesn't subdivide or collapse or anything. So some tools don't. Keep your wireframes on as you get used to using these tools. You'll figure out which ones do and do not work with subdivision or dynamic topology anyways. All right. On a side note here, there's a couple shortcuts and hotkeys you might want to keep in mind. And some of the basics are going to be F. So you can expand or shrink your brush size. That's the radius of it. Shift F to change the strength. Okay. Smaller, larger. There's also Control F, which allows you to rotate. So if you're using some kind of alpha map or stamp or some kind of odd shaped brush, you can certainly use Control R there. Oops, sorry, Control F. All right. And now to turn dynamic topology on and off, it's Control D. You can turn it on and off if you need to. So that's pretty useful. Highly recommend, if you don't have one, a drawing pen or tablet. Okay. A drawing pen or tablet. And when you get this thing, you know, set it up however you need to use it for Blender. In this case, I got it on monitor 2. So it's only going to work on monitor 2. But the pen mapping itself, I don't use the back barrel button. I use the front one. I set up for middle click. And so now I can use the keyboard and the pen. I don't even really need to touch the mouse while I'm sculpting. So I can just simply use the keyboard and the pen to kind of orbit around and do all kinds of fun stuff. And get in there and do that. If you hold shift in draw, you can smooth. Okay. Sometimes this might be too strong or too soft. The smooth tool here, you can change the strength around. And anytime you're using another tool and you hold shift and it lets you smooth, it'll use that value instead, basically. Okay. So this is dynamic topology sculpting in a nutshell. It's actually quite simple. It's really easy to use. There's a couple different tools here. Obviously, we got regular sculpt. We got draw sharp, which is I still use quite a bit, even though it doesn't work with subdivide collapse very well. There's the clay add tool, which is pretty interesting. You'll have to play around with some of these to get used to them. You can also hold control and use the inverse operations. Clay strips is really nice. Probably won't see it much on this low resolution mesh, but sometimes it gets a little janky. Under brush, this is one you can actually change tip roundness and turn it up quite a bit, and it'll give you a little bit of a smoother result. I'll show you this here later on, I think, when we get into the other types of sculpting. There's like a thumb tool. It's like smashing your thumb into the surface a little bit. Layer strips, which can be quite useful in some instances because this brings up the mesh a certain predetermined amount. And you can actually change that determined amount right here, so you can make things a lot more dramatic or less dramatic. Might be something you want to utilize. There's the inflate tool. Blows things up like a balloon, kind of. There's like a half sphere, create sphere bump thing. There's the crease tool, which works really well for creating hard edges. And you can hold control to create like little ridges too. Smooth tool, basically holding shift is what that does on any other tools. So the flatten tool, Allows you to kind of flatten the surface out a little bit. It does create a little bit of waviness to your models. So there's kind of a different way you can configure it, which will make it work a little bit better in my opinion. But I'll save that for just a little tips and tricks video, since we're kind of new to sculpting here. This is the crevice fill, I think, right? Yeah, fill tool. So if you were to, say, create some creases in here, something like this, this crevice fill should, in theory, fill that area. And it can be useful, but it can be a little bit weird to use sometimes, so keep that in mind. And last but not least is scrape, which I find extremely useful. It's like dragging a flat object or a knife against the side of something. So if you ever done traditional sculpting, you'll understand how this works, because a lot of the traditional sculpting tools are scrapers. And you get real used to just kind of scraping things. You can, of course, change the values there as well. A lot of these other ones kind of do similar functionality. We got multi-plane scrape, which kind of pinches things, but you can also hold control and just use it like a kind of knife scraping against the side. Pinch brings mesh together. Grab tool, extremely useful. You can grab sections and pull it around. Now take note here, as I use this, even with dynamic topology, it doesn't subdivide the mesh. So you're going to have to go through this and kind of correct it just by going over it with something that does. So you can see the regular clay strips there that will do that. Elastic deform is very similar, except it's like turning everything into jello. Kind of moves all the mesh around, even in stuff that's not really close nearby it. Snake hook's real cool, and this is actually a very good blocking tool. So you can make giant shape changes real quick, and it does subdivide. So if you need like horns or something, you're making a snail, and you need to bring down this whole element here, like we'll just do a snail head or something. You can see how fast you can block out these ideas. And it's not really a big deal. Change the size around if needed. Hold shift and smooth it, right? So there you go. Just like that, snake hook is pretty awesome. It's one of my favorite tools. Got another thumb kind of shifter smudger thing. This here, the pose tool, is good for like fingers, limbs, and well, even maybe this snail antenna. So if I was to click and I make the brush big enough so we can see that line go to the kind of towards the base there. If I click at the top here, I can kind of rotate from the base like it's a bone. It's like a temporary bone system basically. And then we've got the nudge one here, which kind of lets you nudge things around. Twist. Twist can be quite useful as well. We got side relax, boundary. We'll skip those. Cloth. You can play with this one if you want. It tries to simulate cloth in the surface, and it does work. I just don't find it all that useful. Instead, there's a cloth modifier down here, cloth filter. This one's real nice. You can actually use it with gravity, or you can inflate things, or expand, or pinch, or scale. So if I use inflate, and I just click and drag to the right here, you'll see it acts like a balloon kind of, and it kind of simulates cloth there in the viewport, which is real cool. Now, going back, let's go back a little bit. We have the masking tool. Masking tool, I'm going to turn off wireframes for this, is really useful. There's a shortcut panel for this. It's A. So you have all your mask options for the most part right here, but if not, there's some additionals up here as well, which is real nice. So keep that in mind. Oops, sorry, mask, not that one. That was the sculpt one. So you have all these different things in here you can play with for your mask. But generally speaking, the easiest way to use this thing, I turn it to max personally. That's just what I do. So Shift F, turn the strength up. Sometimes depending, I'll change the fall off. Right now it's on smooth. Sometimes it's too big for me. I'll go to sharper. So it makes a smaller mask selection. But if you go back to smooth, you'll see that it's much bigger. Okay, and if you press Shift F, there's a preview of that curve, by the way, so you can see which one you're using when you change your pressure there, or your strength. Nonetheless, let's say you wanted to sculpt something somewhere. You didn't want to affect the rest of the mesh. So let's just do this top section here. We're going to only sculpt right here under the eyes and in the middle. All right, we only want to sculpt this area. Well, generally speaking, you're masking out what you don't want to sculpt on, right? So you can sculpt on everything around that. I'm going to hit Control Z and go back. But if you press A, you'll see you have invert right there at your disposal. So you can invert it, and now you can sculpt on only that section. So you can come in and you can say maybe you want like a little nose or something in here. Really useful, right? Maybe a little bit of a ridge here, a little bit of a bump back there, smooth it down a little. Okay. And voila. So now you can actually press A and clear the mask. So you can use it pretty fluently. Like it becomes second nature to just grab that tool and just kind of be like, I want this area only right now. And then you'll see that because I have mirror on, it does both sides, but A, invert, boom. Oh, switch to an actual sculpt tool here. Maybe I want that, right? Clear it, boom. Just like that, quick and easy, it's done. The inflate tool for things like this can be quite useful. So if I want to make eyes, I can do that. Use Sculpt Draw Sharp. Just pushing the bottom here a little bit. So you can see how this is working out now. Hold Control with Sculpt Draw Sharp. I can pull out, start defining shapes. And this is low resolution. You want to work low resolution to high resolution. You don't want to go too crazy at first. You'll kind of regret it because you need to get your basic ideas right before you start adding details. And so, you know, the idea of where the nose is, kind of the overall shape of it and things like that. So we're going to go over draw face sets here towards the end. We also have other types of masks. So we got like box mask, lasso mask, line mask. So you can do just like that kind of a selection. And that can be quite useful too. So keep that in mind. Or like a box mask. Okay. There's a mesh filter, which is extremely useful. Right now it's set to inflate, but you could do something like smooth. Grab, click, drag to the left or the right. You can see you can smooth or not, right? You could do sharpen, enhance details, all kinds of different fun things in there. Very useful, especially when you're using the voxel system to sculpt. There's something called face sets. I'm going to show you in detail how to use face sets, but just keep in mind that's going to come in just a second. So right now, what we are going to do is switch from, we're going to go from, we got to have the tool selected to see dynamic topology here. We're going to turn dynamic topology off, right? So Control D. We're going to use the remesh system instead. And so I like to configure this with fixed poles, smooth normals, and also preserve face sets. Because we're going to go over face sets. I'm going to show you how that works in a second. But if you click remesh right now, it's going to do a voxel size of 0.1 meters. So if I click remesh, it's pretty detailed. You can see how much it broke the mesh down. Here's another trick. You can set that resolution, the voxel size, by hitting Shift R. And you can make it more dense or less dense. And it gives you a little preview here of what's going on. So if you want it really dense, I'm just going to do, I don't want to go too dense for this tutorial or it'll start to chug along, but make it a little bit more dense here. If I press Control R now, it's going to remesh it. All right, so fixed poles, smooth normals, face sets, remesh. All right, so it should do that every time from now on. Control Z back, I guess I undid the settings there. So when you remesh it, what it's doing is it's just automatic voxel retopology. And sometimes it does pretty good. Like it's pretty good to work with. It's good to sculpt with, but it does create these areas like this and like this little area. These are called poles. And if you look at the mesh, when you up-res it, it's going to be more dense in those areas if you're using like a multi-resolution on top, and it can cause a little bit of problems. But as long as you're just using remesh, anytime those poles create these little weird shapes in the surface, you can certainly just kind of smooth them out. Sometimes that'll get rid of them, or just press Control R and remesh it again, and sometimes it'll take care of them, okay, and smooth them out for you. It doesn't always work 100% though. So, you know, when you see people using this method, generally speaking, I think it's real good for block out of characters. It's real good to get the general ideas going. Then you should retopo on top of it, and then maybe do your detailed sculpt on top of your retopo or something like that. So retopo just means you're going to create a new model off of this model, and you're going to basically manually create a model using this as the snapping surface or whatever. Just to give you a quick demo of that, I'm going to create a mesh plane. So this is kind of the manual way of doing it. So I take this plane, and I'm going to use this as my start for my retopo. I'm going to go to snapping here, set it to face, align rotation to target, back face culling I'll turn on, and you can do individual elements or not. It depends on if you want to. But if I take this vertex here, I'm going to turn the snap on by default. I press G, it'll snap to the surface there, but just barely, right? You're not going to see like a big difference here. Okay. And so it's hard to see it. That's always going to be the biggest problem. You can apply a modifier of shrink wrap, set target to the surface here, or outside surface, or outside, or above surface, whatever you want. You do a slight offset to it. It's going to help you out. Change it from, I don't use matte cap personally. I would go to random so I can see the differences here. And it looks like it's floating above your mesh, and that's because you got to enable show end result. But this allows you to grab a set of vertices, press E and extrude them out, and you can start creating a retopo basically. And press F to kind of fill in between those two lines. And so this is extremely useful because you can even add loop cuts. And in this case, I need to turn on project individual elements because it's going to allow each element to project below itself. So each vertex or each edge. And so this is retopo in a nutshell. You can start retopoing like this very quickly, doing all kinds of different things as you need to. Can get a little bit confusing, but play with it, you'll get used to the idea of retopo real quick. Anyway, so when you retopo something, or you're creating a mesh that you're going to end up sculpting on anyways, you want to make sure you're keeping your faces as square as possible. I think that's the biggest takeaway, because you can create like a mid-poly model, and then you can subdivide this later on. So you'll use something called a multi-resolution. And if I use multi-resolution here, you'll see that we get it right here. I'm going to click subdivide, and it's going to do like a subdivision surface, right? Now I can subdivide. I'll turn off optimal display real quick. You'll see that all those faces stay nice and squared up. And this resolution or multi-res modifier allows you to sculpt on it. All right, but it doesn't do like dynamic topology. It's only going to stretch the mesh that you've made there. So this is why a lot of people do this, so they can now animate their models much cleaner than if they had all of these little triangles and stuff going on here. All these little poles, not triangles, poles, sorry. But so that's retopo in a nutshell. That's the cleanest way to do it, because when you apply that multi-resolution, as long as you modeled everything in squares, and you made sure you didn't use triangles or n-gons, it should subdivide well. You should be able to sculpt on it still, create a highly detailed mesh, and not have any problems. Now, this object here, we're going to go back into Sculpt Mode. I can't press Control-R and keep doing that number, but we can also apply multi-resolution on this, but you're going to see the difference here. If I click subdivide, I'm going to go one more time. Take me right to 500,000. And those poles suddenly become a lot more apparent. You can see every little cranny, like every little section here that becomes a problem. And this, generally speaking, it looks smooth right now, but as you start to detail sculpt on this, it's not going to stay smooth. So, I mean, it might stay smooth depending on what kind of textures and stuff you're adding, but if you want like super clean, smooth surfaces, you're not going to necessarily get that all the time going with this method. Now, multi-resolution is the most performant way of sculpting, in my opinion. It allows you to use the most polygons. It's going to give you the best experience for doing details. But you just have to be mindful that it might be better to retopo manually, get perfect geometry going, and then work with that instead. Okay. Now, here's a trick. We're using the clay strips brush real quick. I told you to turn that tip roundness up if you wanted to. Here's with it back near default. It looks something like that. And if you turn that tip roundness up, it ends up looking more like that. So it's a little bit nicer in my opinion, and a little bit softer to start with. So that might be something you want to do, and it can be quite useful. Right here you can see where those poles are really messing up that detail. So keep that in mind. If you were to try to remesh again to get rid of them, unfortunately this modifier, it's not going to happen. It doesn't work with the multi-res like that. Okay, now moving on. Let's talk about face sets. Face sets are kind of like using mask in a way, but they're a little bit more interesting. Because let's take this model. We'll go back into Sculpt mode here. I'm going to delete that multi-res. So I don't recommend using multi-res if you're doing voxels. Just keep up-resing it. So Shift R. You know, press Shift R, change your size, make it finer and finer. That's probably the better way to go about it. And so we can come in and we can sculpt, we can smooth things, we can press Shift R, increase the resolution, press Control R. Gives you better control over your face counts too, because multi-res is going to quad pretty much everything. So if you have 100,000, it'll go to 500,000 on the next subdivision. Whereas this method, you can just keep finely tuning it to the face count you want. That's why I say turn face counts on. You're going to find that this is probably the best way to sculpt, in my opinion, just to get a basic block out going. It feels like it has a little bit more control, in my opinion. So it's one of my favorite anyways. All right, so let's say we want to create face sets. Face sets, you can initialize face sets by loose parts. So if you have multiple pieces, by materials, by face set boundaries. And you can even do it from edit mode. So face set from edit mode selection, from visible, from mask, right? So all kinds of different ways to set face mask. And that's just how you're going to set them up from the start. It's growing them, shrinking them, expanding them, etc. It's kind of like the same tools as the masking tool there. But generally speaking, you can use a face set brush here. And this brush, if you were to just click anywhere and start dragging, it's going to do a color, some kind of random color. It's going to look janky. That's okay. All right. And if you clicked again, it's going to do another color. And clicked again, it's going to do another color. Okay. To keep working with the same color, you hold Control. And you start in the color you want to start with. So hold Control and start there. And you can keep working with that same face set. Okay. This is a face set too out here. So if I hold Control and I start going like this, you can see I can kind of work that face set back like so. These are really cool, and they can be a little bit problematic, but they're not too bad. So these edges are sharp, and if I hold Shift and with face set brush here, you'll see it smooths them up a little bit. What it's actually doing is it's creating a line with your topology. So it's actually modifying your mesh and making that face set a little bit smoother. So keep that in mind. It can give you a little bit of a janky result in those kind of areas. The more resolution, usually the better it does, but not always. So sometimes you might have to just kind of fiddle around with this smoothing of the edges if you need to, and try to work them out the best you can. But you know, this is going to allow you to break your model up real fast. So you know, you want to break out the section right here, you can do that. It's not a big deal. All right. And this is why I like this so much, because anytime you want to isolate something, you just hover over it and press F. Oop, sorry, not F, G. No, Jesus. I guess it's H. I'm so used to so many different add-ons, I always forget my hotkeys. It's H, sorry. F is focus mode for machine tools, and so I'm going crazy here, I guess. But there we go. So you can press H, isolate a section, H to get out of it. Just all your presses, H over and over. It's really quite cool. You want to separate something else, you can do that real quick. So maybe you just want to work on some eyeballs or something. All right. Pretty neat. So you can break down a high poly mesh and then focus on only one area. Come in and just sculpt that one area. So maybe we want some certain patterns in here or something. All right. Press H, there we go. It's like a quick mask tool in my opinion. So maybe you want to do some kind of eyeballs or something. Oh, side note, I want to talk about this real quick. This brush, the clay brushes, they have this weird habit of pulling stuff behind it. So keep in mind, you might want to do front faces only with clay strips and clay. These two. It's going to limit that from happening. It's not going to happen quite as much. It still can happen, but it's just not, it's not going to be such a big deal. Otherwise, you can create some real problematic mesh discrepancies and stuff. So I can isolate that. Maybe I want to do some strong banding through here, something like that. Maybe I want to punch those nose sections out now. All right, cool. That's not a great looking nose, but you get the idea. How you can isolate and stuff. So this is, once again, like right here. I just want to add some little markings back and forth. I can quickly do that with this and not think about it. You can see how much that makes a difference. So if I go back to Sculpt Mode, it should still be there. If I do use a remesh, make sure you have face sets on. So if I press Control R, it keeps them. If you had that off, press Control R, it just gets rid of it, right? So keep that in mind. Control Z back. All right, occasionally you'll want to use textures. And usually when you start using textures, you need a really dense mesh. I'm going to bump this down a little bit more. Hit Control R. Oop. Let's turn that back on. I'm going to put it at like 400,000, I think. Hopefully I didn't go too low there. 300,000 is fun. All right, so I want to use textures. Here we got a texture, and depending on how much detail I want to add and how quick, I'll use a draw brush or a clay brush to add textures. So I'll use draw for like big detail changes, and I'll use clay for like finer textures and stuff like that. So I'm going to do a texture here real quick, and we're going to go to texture. So we're going to use clay brush. We'll go to texture, click new. We're going to change it to area plane. Okay, and that's all I need to change for now. We're going to go down to this texture panel, click open. And in my texture library, I have a set of alphas already kind of piling up here. So I got sand, and alphas are black and white images, basically height maps, displacement type maps. You can make these yourself, or you can download some offline from different sources, such as like ZBrush. ZBrush has free PSD files. So you can download alphas there if you needed to. And I actually have a bunch of those, by the way. They work pretty good. So this sand one is a textures.com image. I ran it through Substance, bitmap to material, created a height map from it. And you can see here, if you just draw with it, it's going to do this weird number. Not always the best results. Sometimes you need to change the spacing up. So I change it up to 60. You can see I can kind of stamp it on in areas, which is nice, but not the way I want to use it. There's one called Anchored, which I use a lot. And Anchor just lets you click, drag, and then scale it on that area. And this is one of my favorite ways. So if I turn up the strength, you'll see I can do that like so. Quickly create this kind of a pattern, right? No problem. There's also instead of using area plane, we can switch it to Stencil. We'll turn stroke back to spacing and set it down to like 5. Okay. And Stencil pops up in the corner here. You can right click, drag it around, Control, right click, rotates it, Shift, right click, scales it. That's pretty much all you need. So you can move it into place, scale it, make it larger, smaller. Just keep in mind, don't work to the edge. You want to work in the center usually, or try not to put your brush off to the edge like that anyways. So I'm going to isolate that by pressing H. And now I can change my brush strength to whatever I want, and I can just draw with it like normal, and whatever's below this will take the effects of this this texture here. And if you get it to the corners, the edges, like I was saying earlier, you'll see it creates like little lines and stuff that you might not want, so keep that in mind. You can always make it smaller if you need more detail out of it. All right. Now, I just hit everything. Whoops. Let's hide this piece. I'm going to go ahead and turn, well, anytime you want to change that texture, you can duplicate it, and then you'll have another set here. So you don't have to always overwrite the original. You can just go here, click open, grab another alpha. Pretty useful. Okay, I'm going to save this scene, and we're going to restart Blender here. So we're going to save this as Sculpt Demo. And before we do anything else, one last thing I want to talk about before you exit this scene. If you have multiple objects, so you're sculpting a cube. I still got snapping on, so I'm going to turn that off. So you're sculpting a couple different objects, a head and teeth, or whatever the case may be. If you go Control J, join them together, go into Sculpt Mode, you can do face sets, initialize face sets by loose parts. You'll see you get different face set for every loose part. That's pretty useful, but let's say you don't want to combine them. You can actually go into Sculpt Mode, and under Sculpt here, Transfer Sculpt Mode, you can actually assign this to quick favorites or a shortcut. And what you do is you press Q, Transfer Sculpt Mode here, assign to quick favorites. Save your preferences once you do that. You hit Q, now you can actually see Transfer Sculpt Mode. You can actually click in any of these and switch to what you're sculpting on. Turn Dynamic Topology on, Transfer Sculpt Mode, Control D, turn it on. All right, so you can start sculpting now on these objects. All right. Just keep in mind our origin points will take effect on the symmetry and whatnot. And this is why I recommend deleting the vertex data or the UV data or any other kind of data that might be found in this menu, because a lot of times you don't want to keep turning that you don't want to keep turning on that dynamic topology, so it's better to just do it once and then transfer your mode. Oh, nope, wrong button. Turn it on there, transfer sculpt mode, turn it on here. Maybe you gotta delete it while it's on. There you go. Okay, so now we can just transfer like it's nothing. They should all have dynamic topo on, so that's a good way to work. All right, Now that's out of the way, let's talk about add-ons. There's one add-on I really highly recommend, which is in the description of my videos always. And I'm going to exit Blender entirely here. This add-on is called Sculpt Alpha's Manager. Extremely useful. So if I go Sculpt Mode here, oh, let's open that sculpt, my bad. Ooh, you know what? I don't know if it's going to work right because of the default scene here, but we'll see. All right, so Sculpt Alpha's Manager under Texture. The way you set this up, go to Add-ons here, Sculpt Alpha's Manager. You create somewhere a texture folder called alphas, and then you can create subfolders in it if you need to, and you place those black and white alpha maps in there. And what ends up happening is you can reference that file here in Preferences when you set up the add-on. It gives you this little panel. So every subfolder would have whatever you want in it. So in this case, if you wanted some like little circles, you can do things like that, right? Maybe you want to use some, let's do anchored. That's pretty rough there. Let's not do that. Let's go back to area plane. There we go. So maybe I wanted something like that on it, right? And then I want to change my alpha. I just click and drag. I can find more alphas. And as long as you put those alphas in that folder, you'll be able to reference them if they're PNG or TIFF files. They should be updating it to include PSD files, but I don't know if they've done that yet. Actually, I need to check and see if they've incorporated that yet. But you can see how you can add a lot of detail to things real quick and get a pretty unique look going on. All right, so Sculpt Alpha's Manager, big one. Another one I really highly recommend, and it doesn't always work correctly or get everything right, but we'll play with it here in a second. This is a paid add-on. Sculpt Alpha's Manager is free, but the paid add-on is Quad Remesher. This one is not free. Make sure your mesh is kind of sealed up. There's no major issues. And notice this one's real thin, and this one's kind of thicker. I'm going to go to Sculpt Mode real quick. And I'm going to symmetrize. This is negative X on the left. This is positive X on the right. That's what the little icon here means. So I'm going to symmetrize negative X to positive X. Might take a second for this one, but there. Because sometimes it loses its mirroring ability. And just a side note here, I want to mention this real quick. When I'm doing these tutorials, I am live on Twitch. So I will get comments coming in from Twitch, and I'll answer those as they come in. And then, but most of these are, if you're watching this on a video website, I do both. So follow me on Twitch if you get a chance. You can come watch and interact while I do these things. Whenever I get a chance to do them, I do them, and you'll just see me randomly come on Twitch and just start making these tutorials and stuff. But got one user here saying, I can't believe you only had 8 followers. Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't taken the time to do a lot of videos and stuff like that. So I had a channel. I had my YouTube channel under a different name before, and it was doing quite well. I had like 200 followers on it. But Twitch I've had for a while. I just never used it. And I finally took the time to figure out how to set up the stream and be able to record at the same time. So, and then not have like a huge performance hit where I can actually still work in Blender with fairly high poly. I mean, like 1 million's not too bad, but this system that I'm on right now is a Ryzen 5700G. So I don't even have a graphics card right now. And I'm still able to hit, when I'm not recording or streaming, I can hit roughly 20 million faces here using a multi-resolution modifier. And so dynamic topology with the triangulation's a little bit rougher on this. But while I'm streaming, I can only go up to like 1 million with multi-res or triangles either way. So I get like 1 or maybe 2 million. And then it just really starts to stutter and slow down. But nonetheless, so we kind of went through all this. This is kind of fun, but here, we're going to go back to object mode. So this was a remesh using the voxel system, right? I'm going to use Quad Remesher, which is a paid add-on. It's like $60 for personal use, $100 for commercial use. Keep that in mind. Something like that anyways. You can change your quad counts, what kind of resolution you want. So right now I'm at 1,300 triangles, 650,000 faces. So I'm just going to bump it down to 500. No, let's do 700,000 faces. And this might take a little while. And I'm not going to change any other settings here. I'm just going to make sure the symmetry is on for X. I want everything to be symmetrical. Remesh it. And this might take a little bit while I'm streaming. Oh, no, it's not taking too long. It might hang up at 70. Nope, not too bad. Quad Remesher is pretty awesome. And the reason being is that it really it does create poles still, but it doesn't create quite as many as the voxel system. Like you'll see these poles kind of scattered out through here. And it's just, overall, it's a little bit of a cleaner mesh. But this gets even better if you were to go low with it. So if you wanted to bake onto a low poly mesh, let's say we want a 5,000 polygon mesh here, you would duplicate this and then just remesh it. And before you know it, what ends up happening is you have a pretty basic mesh to start off with. And you could try to clean this up if you wanted. I don't know if that would necessarily be a great idea. I think manually retopo is still great for animation, but if you're doing like static meshes that go in the game, this is the best thing ever, because it really does allow you to do a lot of quick static mesh and get it broken down to some pretty basic elements real quick. So I'm gonna set it all the way down to 200 and remesh. Let's see if it kills that. See, it doesn't even kill those little thin areas there, which is pretty awesome. So this is completely usable. You could clean this up super fast for game models. So maybe you don't need this face here. Well, sometimes you get these crazy loops still. Bad mesh flow, but something like that. Maybe you don't need that, you know? Maybe you don't need this one. You can break this mesh down however you want. All right. And so for the most part, I've got you kind of started in sculpting, and you should be able to have a little bit of fun with it. I don't expect you to have remesher here, quad remesher, but you know, you can use that voxel system, go crazy with it. You can even use that to break things down into low polys, or you can use like a decimate. So, you know, if you never use a decimate modifier, you're doing static mesh, you can do decimate after, and then do like 0.2 or something. You'll see it breaks down your mesh. It's not quite as good as quad remesher, but it's still useful. Triangulate it. So a lot of times I'll do this for Unity static mesh. When I put things into Unity, I just decimate it because it's super quick. It's really good for LODs. If you're going to do like janky LODs that don't really matter, do it. But that's it for this video. You know how to sculpt now. You know how to do a little bit of sculpting, how to use some of the sculpting tools. Showed you a quick little thing about retopo and remeshing and all that fun stuff. So nonetheless, hope you enjoyed the video. And I will check you out next time. All right. Take care.